Hey, how's it going?
It is going great. I am sort of on pins and needles today because as I'm focusing on coaching, I'm doing some of my coaching privately, like we were talking about several weeks ago through associate leadership. But I applied recently for a part time coaching role at a company that I think would be a really good fit for me and still give me the space to do my own work. And I am just sitting here waiting for an answer as to whether they will offer me an interview. And I'm super excited about it.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I'm super pumped. It seems like the kind of company that really takes good care of its people. And that's a really big deal. So
Yeah.
I am doing great. How are you doing?
Well, I'm having a very opposite work experience. My work doesn't leave me time to do what I need to do. In fact, I can be forced in on my weekends because we have low coverage. And that's exactly what happened to me last night. I had gotten up at 5 in the morning, just got up, did my thing. I went to church, all the things. And then late in the day, when it was too late to take any naps or anything, I got notification that I was going to be forced in from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. And it's an hour drive to work. And so I didn't get home until 4. It was nearly a 24-hour day for me. And that drive home was a little sketchier than I wanted it to be. But yeah, so it's just now I'm all sorts of messed up on a couple hours of sleep and a big to-do list today. So, it is what it is.
Oh, man. Well, as always, thank you for serving in a 911 call center. I would hate to be called in on my day off, but I am glad for your city's sake that somebody was manning the call center.
Yeah, it has to get done. And that spirit of service is great and it carries you to some extent. And then at other times you're just irritated and you're like, why do I have to go in? This is,
Oh, no doubt.
yeah. Anyway, yeah. So what's on your mind for this episode of On the Phone with Josh?
Oh, I want to talk about family and marriage roles today, particularly coming out of my own personal experience recently. I left church work and pastoring 6 months ago now, and it has given me far more space to be with my family. It has resulted in me doing some concrete things differently at home. And it just has me thinking a lot about this intersection of transitions in life and family roles and how to navigate all of that. Because almost everyone I talk to who is my age ish has experienced at least one significant transition in their life since they got married, if they're married. And that really always seems to play an impact or have an impact on how we relate to our families. And so I just thought that would be an interesting conversation topic. Does that make sense?
Oh my gosh. This makes so much sense and it connects with my life in two very significant ways. First, I am studying to be a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm taking a class right now on systems theories and the way that family systems operate. And one of the consistent needs for a licensed marriage and family therapist is to help families renegotiate roles. A, because they may not have ever done it well in the first place, or B, because their life circumstances have changed now and they need to resettle the deck, if you will, and figure out what are we going to do now and how are we going to operate differently. And negotiating that transition is really, really key. So I find it really fascinating from that perspective, but then I also find it really fascinating from my own personal perspective because right now, my oldest is 20 years old. My middle child is about to graduate high school in a couple of months. And then my youngest is a freshman in high school. He has his permit. And very, very soon, once he gets his license, he's going to be involved in all sorts of things. And literally nobody is going to need us for anything. Nobody's going to need us to take him to track practice or to run over and pick this up or whatever. Like, we're only going to have one kid under 18. He's going to drive himself to school. He's going to drive himself to his activities. He's going to come home when he needs to. He's going to need a little bit of food and a little bit of guidance and send him right back out the door. And that's just really all we're going to be there for. So our roles are shifting in our own household. So this is such a fascinating topic.
Yeah, this is exactly it. You hit on, I think not only the circumstances change, like my job situation, but the people in the family mature and grow. And so the family itself is this always changing system of dynamics
Mm-hmm.
that therefore requires, what's the word you used? Renegotiate.
Yeah.
There's this constant need to renegotiate our roles. And, outside of the stuff that happened with me switching jobs, my 16-year-old, we've had certain areas that we have experienced friction that we've argued about literally since he was born. And he is no longer at the point where I can force him to do things. But that doesn't mean he always makes the right choices.
Sure.
And it doesn't mean that I fully pull away my parental responsibilities of providing oversight. And so, again, I think this idea of renegotiating roles in a way that is agreed upon by everybody becomes incredibly, incredibly important and wildly confusing.
Right. Well, and there's a certain amount of identity wrapped up in the roles that we carry, right? We already talked about the fact that I work at a 911 center, and there's this sense of duty and sense of responsibility to the community that goes with that. That's part of my identity. And were I to step away from 911 and not have that anymore, not only would my schedule be different and the demands on my family be different, but I would have to be wrestling through my own identity change because that aspect of me wouldn't be there anymore.
Yeah, this has been fascinating to watch myself go through this exact thing that you're describing. I have always made significantly less money than my wife. When she was in private practice, she made great money. When now as a professor who is also in private practice, she gets paid reasonably well. I've been an associate pastor at an inner city church my whole adult life. This is not something that is going to pay well. As I transitioned out of that role, first of all, the emotional expenditure of trying to figure out who am I now used up energy that could have gone to my family. Like I have often been like wrestling with that and didn't have as much energy as I would like to be as patient or as gracious or as gentle or even as self-aware as I would like. And even in the midst of that, figuring out, for example, my daughter went to an event. Stop me if I've said this on the podcast, but a couple of weeks ago, my daughter was at an event. I picked her up maybe 20 minutes before it ended from this event at her church. And she was mortified that I would pick her up early. But I happened to have been running some errands and I had groceries in the car and, eggs and milk and ice cream and things. And so I just needed to pick her up and go home. And church is not that far from home. It would have been 20 minutes for me to drop everything off and then come back and get her. That was super out of the way and I didn't really feel like doing it. But it was the first time in her life she had ever not been the last person at a church event.
Oh,
because
sure.
she's been a pastor's kid her whole life.
Right.
So it didn't even occur to her that I would pick her up early. And it felt like a violation to her for me to say, hey, it's like 15, 20 minutes from the end. It's not that big of a deal. Well, of course it's been a big deal for the 20 years when you were in charge of the events. Now that you're not in charge, it's not a big deal anymore. She didn't say this by any means,
Sure,
but
sure.
as I was processing what made this a big deal to her, I think this is a piece. Her expectations were set when I was running events, and we were always the ones leaving last, cleaning up and walking out the door. And surely that contributed to the disorientation she experienced when I asked her to leave or told her without her consent that she had to leave an event early.
Yeah. Well, these are the scripts that we operate by, and we grow accustomed to how these scripts go. And
Mm-hmm.
this is so fascinating because I watched a therapist on video working with a step family, and she referred to the step parent as a perpetual outsider. And the reason is that the parent and their children have already agreed on all of these scripts, all the way down to where do towels go? How late do people stay up? How do we relate to one another in conversation? How much can I expect of your attention and your time? All of those scripts existed before the step parent arrived, and all of them are unwritten, unexamined expectations in the family unit that the step parent just feels ostracized from. And I think even though you guys are still the same family, you've not had a divorce or separation or anything like that, what you have is a change in roles and a change in the scripts that everybody operates by. And that's what you're talking about with your daughter. This doesn't match the script. The script is I stay until everybody else is gone. And it was an unexamined expectation that all of a sudden you guys did differently and had no prior conversation around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting as you describe those scripts is the moments in which I even have scripts with myself. I mentioned the fact that my wife has always made more money than I have because as long as I was doing a job that felt vocational, God called me to church work. It was never an issue for me, never has been. I don't care. I don't feel in any way uncomfortable. That's how I balanced the scales. I was doing the thing God wanted me to do. The minute that is no longer the case, suddenly having the financial burden on my wife became uncomfortable for me.
Hmm.
And to be clear, not on any level, because my wife said something, she has been beyond supportive and ceaselessly encouraging as I've tried to sort this all out. But I feel the need to contribute financially on a level that I've never felt before because the old script disappeared.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like the mission was originally we are serving our community together in our own unique ways, and the money is just the money. And now that you're not on that mission and the mission has shifted toward earning money, now you feel like you're not doing your part.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would say the mission has shifted to earning money per se, but I would say it has taken at least a greater significance because I don't mind asking weight to land on my wife if I'm doing ministry. And that in and of itself, as I am processing it out, is really questionable. One of the wildly important things people in ministry need to think through is the weight in relationship, emotions, time, energy, finances, all of those things that is going to or is landing on their significant others. And it has to be something everybody buys into. But I was willing to make those asks for the sake of the local church. And I felt like that was a decision we had made together. Now that we're not there, yeah, I don't feel comfortable with as much of the weight landing on her shoulders. That doesn't feel appropriate.
So has this impacted you in other contexts outside of earning money or having a job of some sort?
Yeah, I can see it, in some very simple, concrete ways as I'm also wanting to renegotiate the way time is spent. As my job responsibilities decreased, hers increased. She went from being a professor in a program to the director of that of the same program. And I find myself wanting to pick up extra things for the family. And so part of this is grocery shopping. Part of it is I have taken it on as 100% my job to make sure the kids end up where they're supposed to be. And I feel like if she drives the kids somewhere, I need to apologize for it because I have written a script there. Perhaps I have written a script in permanent marker that maybe we actually wrote in pencil. It is generally my responsibility, but I just feel like, man, you're doing so much. I don't want you to have to do more stuff. And so I want to get the kids wherever they're going. I want to make sure that they eat well, all those kinds of things. And a lot of that comes from the fact that her job requires her to work some evenings. So because she's working evenings, I would like to have a lot of the traditional evening time stuff taken care of.
This is really fascinating. Your language changed when you talked about the roles that you had when you were in ministry. You said, we wrote those scripts. And everything I heard in what you just described sounded like you wrote those scripts on your own. There was a whole lot of I language. I did this, or I feel like I need to do that.
Yeah, I was feeling that as well. I think we had the conversations about them, me and my wife, but we made them guidelines. They are available scripts, not mandatory scripts. Maybe that's a way to put it. And so it's not that she is unwilling to be part of those things. It's just if I can take the primary responsibility for it, then great. And if she can jump in, she will. I have a hard time with that kind of permeable boundary or flexible responsibility. I do much better with something a little bit more black and white. It's my responsibility or it's not. And if I do it, I'm succeeding. And if I'm not doing it, I'm failing. And that is not the grid we set up. And so the flexible boundary that we created, or the flexible role descriptions that we created together. The rigidity that I experience within them is self-imposed.
It's fascinating. As you're describing that, it reminds me of a family meeting we had just last week, because we're a busy family, right? I'm working full-time plus and going to graduate school, and Shelly is working part-time and doing all of the grocery shopping and the cleaning and the cooking and the running the kids everywhere. And my oldest two are very, very active. Well, all three of them, all three of the kids are very, very active. So we're just on the go all the time. And what ends up falling by the wayside is a community participation in keeping the house clean. And so as we were talking about this, one of the things that we had done as a family was, are you familiar with the app called Nipto?
No.
Nipto puts gamification to doing chores. And so each chore gets a point value that you as a family get to assign, and you can customize all the different chores that are in there. They have a bunch that are preloaded that you can choose from, or you can create your own. And every time somebody does a chore, they get points for it. And you're trying to keep your Nipto score relatively close to everybody else's. And so if everybody's within 10% of one another, then everybody's Nipto is happy. And then, if you're like between 50 and 90%, then you're sad or you're doubtful or whatever. So you're trying to keep your character happy by doing as many chores as everybody else or getting as many points as everybody else. And so we tried this as a family. And the feedback I got from some of my kids in the last meeting was, hey, I didn't like that. It was too broad. I need a specific task. It is my responsibility to make sure X happens. And if I know that that is my responsibility, then I will do it, rather than everything is everyone's responsibility and just do something. That was too broad for them, and they needed something a little bit more tangible. And so even in our negotiation of roles, we're not just negotiating the roles, but we're negotiating how flexible are those roles or how rigid are those roles, because everybody needs a little something different from them.
Yeah. Well, and one of my working hypotheses that I can share because I come down on the wrong side of it is that the process of going from rigid thinking to flexible thinking is one of the processes we are working on as we mature. One of the sort of gauges of maturity is, can we have flexible thinking? Often I find this to be true with my kids. Oh, they're not at a place where they are ready for that kind of flexible thinking yet. They need something that's concrete or consistent or inflexible. That's kind of where they're at right now. Now, that may be appropriate for a 14-year-old and not appropriate for a 43-year-old. And so I think there's something there about maturing, is my point.
Well, sure. But I think there's also something to be said for the graciousness that you're offering to your kids that maybe you're not offering to yourself. If that's where you are, that's where you are.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously,
That's a good point.
We can grow, we can strive for something else, but if we're in a certain place, well, then we're in a certain place.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is where I think there's a lot that's being said right now. And again, we as evangelicals don't land well on this particular issue, but the idea of radical acceptance or self-affirmation sometimes seems a little floaty to us. But I think this is a great example of where this kind of thing is really important. Focusing my sense of identity on where I ought to be will not actually help me navigate my relationship with my kids. Focusing my sense of identity on where I currently am and extending grace both to them where they're at and to myself where I'm at, and accepting myself where I'm at, A, may be a prerequisite to growth, and B, may be a prerequisite to having an unfrustrated relationship with my kids.
Yeah, I completely agree. Boy, I really love that you said that that's a prerequisite for growth. And I absolutely think so. And I think sometimes we miss that in our evangelical context, because I think there's such an emphasis on what the ideal is or what truth is. And I don't think we allow people sometimes to be where they are and to grow toward the ideal. And that just seems to be the way Jesus operated, though. Like, he met people right where they were at, didn't expect more from them in that moment than they could give, and yet held very firm ideals. I think that's that flexible thinking, if you will, that I think is, as you said, a mark of maturation. And we need to do that theologically just as much as we need to do it in other contexts.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So let's talk just for a moment. What do you think, what is a healthy expression of renegotiating roles? Because as we said, our life circumstances are changing. Our families are constantly in flux. You know, I'll back way up and use an illustration from just becoming parents, right? I remember seeing kind of an acquaintance at the time become a parent. Like, they had their first child, and it was fascinating to watch the mother adjust to being a mother. And I remember remarking to Shelley, that individual is so new in her motherhood that she is still, and I used her for her first name, we'll say Janet. She's still Janet. She hasn't yet become mom. And it wasn't a bad thing. It was just where she was in renegotiating her identity and her roles. And, you know, Janet has long since become mom and done a phenomenal job. It was just an observation in that early going, first child, she's still Janet. She's still operating as Janet and not necessarily as mom. And I feel like we're always doing that. We're always renegotiating our identity and our roles simultaneously as our families develop and as our life circumstances change. And so what do you think are elements required to do that well?
I don't know if I would say required, but I can say there are two things that have helped me as I'm going through the process that I'm in. One, an active and ongoing practice of mindfulness. The simple mindfulness practice of paying attention to my breathing for a set amount of time in order to practice paying attention when I get distracted from the thing I'm trying to pay attention to, and therefore learning in that practice to see my own thoughts as thoughts rather than just as an inherent and intrinsic part of myself. All of that allows me to be a little bit more self aware. So if I'm aggravated with my kids because of a way that they respond, mindfulness helps me go from I'm aggravated to I'm experiencing aggravation, which is a very subtle shift. But I'm aggravated is a state of being. I'm experiencing aggravation is not a thing I have to respond to. And it's not who I am. It's just a thing I'm experiencing, and that's okay. I can experience aggravation and still continue on with a full control over my own actions and behaviors. It doesn't own me anymore. And mindfulness for me has helped me create space between my reactions and my choices, a space to pay attention to my reactions. And that's been really valuable to me. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I think is off-time conversations. I got in a fairly significant argument with my son the other day, and I was deeply upset about it. And I didn't behave the greatest. I didn't behave the worst, but I'm not giving myself an A+ on my behavior. I'm not giving him an A+ on his behavior. And I sat with how upset I was and came back to it the next day at a time when we had time and I was calm and he was calm and we could have a real debrief / autopsy conversation about what happened. Because this sort of renegotiating roles that we're talking about, you can't do it in the moment. And so if you notice a role needs to be renegotiated, it has to be its own conversation at a later date, at least in my experience.
Yeah. There's a word that kind of bubbled up for me, and it applies to both of your statements there. It's just curiosity. And curiosity is one way of saying pay attention. You're being curious. Why am I behaving this way? Why am I feeling this way? What is happening for me in this moment? What was particularly frustrating, right? It's being very curious about your own situation and your own reaction. But then you're also saying that you use this word autopsy. And I think autopsy is a very curious event. Why did this happen? Tell me why you reacted the way you did. Why did I react so strongly to that reaction? And right, it's a very curious thing. And when we stop to be curious, we learn a lot about the situation and how to move forward more healthfully.
Absolutely. And so this kind of transitions over. I want to ask you as well. What have you found to be helpful in these renegotiation moments?
Yeah. So honestly, we're in the midst of one. And so I don't want to speak from a position of knowledge. I'm very much in a position of exploring this myself. And to be honest, I think my wife is wrestling with this a little bit more than I am, simply because I have a lot of distractions right now. I have school and I have work, and those roles remain very stable for me. And as a result, over the last few years, she has taken on a lot of the parenting roles. She's the one that gets all the kids to where they need to go, and she's making sure they're doing their homework, and she's staying really closely attuned to the dynamics of their life. And I am jumping in wherever and whenever I can and trying to not fall too far behind relationally. So that's been the dynamic for the last 5 or 6 years. And so as her role as a parent has been so magnified. And now the lives of my kids have shifted so significantly. I think she's feeling that change in dynamics in a different and stronger way than I am. And so I'm kind of looking at it from the other perspective, and I'm hearing you and I'm hearing her, and I'm realizing, okay, I have to be really, really patient. As the person not doing as much renegotiating, I have to be willing to adapt to the changes that she's going to need or the changes that she's going through. And so I think just that patience and watching out for those little moments like your daughter experienced where the script changed and I wasn't prepared for it. And, oh, we're operating under a new script. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one was bad and one is good. It just means we're shifting, we're transitioning, we're changing. And I need to be curious about those changes. And I need to be patient with those changes. And patient particularly with my partner. She's going to be in an uncertain space for a while, which doesn't give me, as her husband, a lot of solid ground. I don't get to rely on her through this in quite the same way because she needs space to renegotiate where she's going to land and where she's going to feel solid before I can really lean on her in quite that same way. So I guess curiosity and patience, if I could sum it up that way.
Which I think it's fascinating to me because I was hearing the idea of curiosity and what you were saying before you said it as well. I think on both sides, whether you're the person negotiating, renegotiating, or you're the person who's watching someone else renegotiate, I think curiosity is really important. And, that is so interesting to me because no one ever said to me, hey, as a dad, make sure you're curious about what your kids are going through. But these transition moments, it's so tempting to say, here's what you need to do. And again, I'm a rigid thinker. I want to do that. But to what degree is the most productive response more inspired by curiosity?
Yeah.
I think curiosity is incredibly valuable as a parenting resource, particularly at least at the stage I'm at with teenagers. Though I think even as with kids, curiosity is a really powerful resource as a parent.
Well, right. And it's one of those things that we have to constantly remind ourselves to be doing because there's so much pressure as a parent, right? You want your kids to turn out right. You want the situation to turn out right. You want to do a good job. Mm-hmm. You want to remain in charge. All of these different things are kind of putting pressure on the moment and not allowing you to just relax a little bit, take a step back, and to get super curious. It's almost like, we talked about this last week when we were wrestling with John 14, and we were like, I don't know where this conversation is going to go, but I just want to dive in. And to not know where it's going to go, and just to be willing to dive in, meet your kids, meet your spouse where they are, and just roll with it is really uncomfortable, especially when we have all these pressures to get it right and to do it right and to do right by our kids or whatever.
Yeah, it's funny that you're bringing this up. So the book that I'm reading, I referenced it several weeks ago by Marsha Reynolds, The Discomfort Zone. It's the coaching book that I'm currently working my way through. She refers back to Martin Buber's I, it, and I, thou relationships.
Yeah.
And her argument is that the major practical difference, and I'm oversimplifying what she's saying here a little bit, but the major practical difference between an I-it relationship and an I-thou relationship is that in an I-it relationship, I'm trying to force a particular outcome on the conversation. But if I really believe you're a human being, I treat you as a thou, then I am no longer going to try to force my outcome on the conversation. I'm not trying to use you to get somewhere. I'm letting you be an authentic collaborator in where we land, which means I'm surrendering control over the moment. And it's fascinating to apply that paradigm to parenting.
Yeah.
Which I had not thought of until you just kind of mentioned the same idea that she was talking about.
Fascinating. Yeah, and that's why we have these conversations, right? We arrive somewhere different than we otherwise would have on our own, which leads me to say, I want to extend this conversation to the audience. Some of you are renegotiating roles as we speak, and this is a very, very relevant conversation for you. Others of you have successfully navigated some transitions and have some wisdom to share. And others of you are about to renegotiate roles and you don't even know it yet. So I would love to hear from everyone. What makes this a healthy process? What have you learned along the way? Maybe some hard lessons you've learned, or maybe you want to take this episode and take it to a friend and say, hey, I understand you're renegotiating roles. Can we talk about what that's like for you? I think that would be a fascinating conversation.
Absolutely. Well, and this would be a fascinating conversation to share with a spouse or somebody that is also renegotiating a role, if in order to say, hey, I'd like to be more curious about what you're going through. I think you're exactly right. But, I also am curious, since curiosity is our theme for today, what else you, Josh from Oregon, have been thinking about?
Yeah. So again, with my counseling program, there's a lot of different voices in the counseling world. There are people that practice counseling from a variety of different lenses and theoretical angles. And so you have all of these kind of competing voices clamoring for your attention, saying, no, this is a better way to do counseling, or this is a better way to think about it, and all of that. And one of the values that I think kind of runs the gamut across all of these orientations, to a larger or lesser degree, is a client-centered approach, allowing the client to set the stage for what they're going to talk about, what values they bring to the conversation, what values and strengths and weaknesses they bring to the potential solutions. All of that needs to be client-driven and client-led, and I support that. What I'm realizing, though, is there's a variety of different applications to that one kind of overarching truth. And it really comes down to what degree does the therapist believe that they need to be, quote unquote, neutral? And there's a lot of emphasis on counselor neutrality. Mm-hmm. And I agree with it. What I don't agree with is that it's possible. And there are other counselors that are coming along and saying it's not possible. You can't be neutral. You are who you are. You bring yourself with you into that moment. And to think that you are neutral, you are probably going to do more harm than you realize, because you assume your neutrality in ways that are just not factual. And so I think it goes back to our study that we did with exclusion and embrace, and this idea that we could negotiate the differences among religions or whatever from a neutral standpoint, or we could negotiate what is just or what is truth from a neutral standpoint. It's impossible. We bring our own lens with us. Wherever you go, there you are. And I'm really wrestling through this idea as it applies to counseling, because I love the client-centered approach, but I also love the honesty that says, this is who I am. This is the lens through which I see the world. And I am working towards seeing it from others' perspective, but I need you to know this is my starting point. And if we trip up over one another's values or one another's lens, I want that to be something we talk about, because I've already from the outset acknowledged this is my lens. This is my starting point. It doesn't have to be my ending point, but it is my starting point. And I really prefer that approach, I think, to the world of counseling, because it doesn't assume a neutrality that really isn't possible in the first place.
100% agree. It's so funny that you bring this up. I was literally in the part of Reynolds' book where she was talking about Martin Buber. He actually proposed an addition to the book's language that she called thou, which was her way of saying, very intentionally saying, we need to release our perspective in order to see people from their perspective.
And by release, do you mean like state it and make it
No,
plain?
she meant stop having it.
Oh,
Like the thing you're saying that's impossible, she was saying that. You need to
oh,
practice being able. And I was like, you're literally, that's impossible. And I also came back to Wolf because his argument for double vision as a solution to this problem, no. We don't need to be perspectiveless. We need to acknowledge that I have a perspective and you have a perspective. And my job is to try to see you from your perspective and me from your perspective.
yes,
That is a solution.
absolutely. And I think that belongs in the counseling room because I want them to be able to say, you asked me that question and it sounds like you have some assumptions from your lens. I want to be able to say, either you're right or you're wrong based on you're right. That is my lens. That is my starting point. Please help me to see me from your perspective. I think that's important. And I think it's honoring to the client.
Yeah. And I can't speak to the particular application of this to a therapy context, but from a coaching perspective, as well as just from a philosophical perspective, my goodness, that at least sounds attainable.
Right. Right.
Rather than inviting me to the impossible and then setting me up for failure, or inviting me to sort of potentially delusional space of being perspectiveless.
Yeah.
I would rather acknowledge that I have a perspective than pretend I don't.
Yep. Exactly.
All right. Just get ready. I am sure that you will be getting texts from my wife when she listens to this.
Oh, I actually debated whether or not to have this be my thought on the podcast because I wanted it to be a conversation I had with your wife. So bring on the text messages.
All right. That's awesome. Well, I'm sure she's glad she's included then.
Yes. All right. You're up. Josh from Missouri. What are you thinking about?
One of the things that I find fascinating is the importance of public discourse and our country's historic failure to do public discourse well in a way that is edifying. Is that fair?
Yep.
So I have a proposed principle that might improve our public discourse if we were to all commit to it. It's not the sort of thing that you could turn into a rule and impose upon other people. But I think that if we committed to it, anyone who commits to this will benefit public discourse far more than they would have otherwise.
Okay. So we are on episode 91 of this podcast, and we are probably 93% of the way through this episode. And now you decide to solve the world's problems?
I am not solving the problem. I am just offering a piece of a potential solution.
Okay.
That's all.
Well, I still want to hear.
Far more humble hopes than to solve the world's problems. But here it is. And I'm still kind of rolling it around. And so I don't know that I have it worded perfectly, but I think we should have at least one key prerequisite to sharing an opinion in public. And that is, you can't share an opinion in public unless you have a deeply respected friend who disagrees with that opinion with whom you have talked about it. This came out of a conversation with my son where we were talking about echo chambers. Are you familiar with this idea that we surround ourselves with people who agree with us?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, great. And he was saying he thinks that American culture is increasingly living in these echo chambers. And I wholeheartedly disagree. I think this has been a part of the American experience since the beginning. I think we have always surrounded ourselves with people who agree with us. And I have some hopes that maybe we're going to actually be better at this in the future. I think our children's generation is deeply disaffected with this, and it excites me. And one of the things I said to him was, no. If you take a person who grew up in a little town of 100 people all of who never left the town. That is as much of an echo chamber as you can possibly have.
Hmm.
And what's limiting is the lack of experience. And often, in order to refine our perspectives, we need the experience of talking to people who deeply, passionately, and respectfully disagree with us. And that helps our opinions go from poorly thought out to well thought out, from simplistic to nuanced. And I think that's not just true for some of our opinions. I think that's true for all of our opinions. And so my suggestion is that we need that kind of engagement for any opinion is ready to be aired in public. If you don't have somebody you can talk about with it that disagrees with you, you haven't properly prepared your opinion for public discourse. So don't spit it out yet.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about this because I feel like this is one of your enduring values. It's one I love and respect, and I think it's done great things in our friendship and in my life, and I hope it's done great things on this podcast. But it is an enduring value for you because how did our friendship start? Our friendship started with you coming up to me and saying, I need somebody to tell me when I'm being an idiot, and I think you're that guy.
Yep, it's true. I think it is true. I think it's been a part of who I am for a long time. And the older I get, the more convinced I am that if you don't have somebody who's going to tell you when you're being stupid, you are probably being stupid a lot.
Yeah.
No matter how smart you sound to yourself.
Oh my gosh. How many times?
Or your cronies.
Right. How many times have I said something to you and gone, okay, now that that's out loud, okay.
No, I've done the same thing. Of course. It's like, because it's not just saying it out loud, right? It's saying out loud to somebody that you know will call you on you're stupid.
Right.
It forces double vision on you is what it does.
Yeah.
Ooh, now I know what I look like from your perspective, and I know what you look like from your perspective. And in that context, what I just said sounded dumb.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's wonderful. So anyway, that's my thought.
That's good. That's good. All right. Well, that brings us to the Which Josh question.
Ooh, and I'm excited because we don't know the answer to this one.
No, we don't. Today's Which Josh question is, which Josh has been to the most states? And we independently had to tabulate this before we started recording. And I don't know your answer, and I'm curious to find out.
So before we answer, I have to tell you, I am assuming it's you. And I'm curious if you have an assumption, and if so, what it is.
So I actually assume it's you, and it's because you grew up in all those tiny little states, and you can knock out 15 different states just by driving 10 miles.
Yes, it's true. As I was doing it, I was like, oh, this is a lot of states in not a lot of space. Okay.
Yeah. I live on the West Coast. Like, I'm in Oregon. I can drive for 8 hours and stay in my state. That was not your developmental experience.
No, not at all. All right. Well, how many states do you have?
26.
Ooh, I beat you by New England. I'm at 30.
Yeah, I figured. Yep, you got me.
I've got you. I beat you by the other New England states. That's true, because you have not been. Have you been to like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont?
No, and no.
Right. I was going to say Connecticut. Ooh, I didn't put. I forgot Connecticut. I'm sorry. I'm at 31. I forgot Connecticut because it's not important.
Yeah. Connecticut, Delaware. Like, I haven't been to any of well, maybe I've been to Delaware. Because
why?
Well, I don't actually remember, because all of those states, it's like,
but you have been to Delaware.
I'm so glad that the New Englander is saying all of this. Yeah, you're right. You beat me because of New England, but it's super fascinating. So I want to know, like, If you could only hit one more state that you have not been to, what would that state be?
Ooh. When we say continental United States,
Why?
I just think the obvious answer is automatically going to be either Alaska or Hawaii.
Well, that's fair because I've been to Hawaii, so my other is, well, Alaska.
Yeah. And my answer is, so I was just like, well, obviously the right answer is Alaska. So, okay, let's not say Alaska. I'm not particularly interested in Hawaii because I'm not a beach guy, though I'm told it's just stunningly beautiful. But if I am not talking about those states, it's probably somewhere in the like Montana kind of area.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that aspect of the country, and it's just looks stunning in pictures.
Montana is just gorgeous. There's nothing really that would make me want to leave Oregon except maybe Alaska and maybe Montana. So my answer would actually be back in your neck of the woods. It would be Maine. I have never been to Maine, and I think, again, it looks beautiful in pictures, and I would love to see the coastline, and I'd love to hike Katahdin, and yeah.
Maine is wonderful, and the like little small town New Englandiness of it is so delightful, and it's the coast, and it really is worth a trip.
Okay. All right. Well, there's our bucket list.
All right.
All right. Well, I will talk to you again next week then.
I can't wait. I'll talk to you then.
All right.